Welcome to China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. In today's special episode, we sat down with Benedict Rogers, co-founder and chief executive of Hong Kong Watch and the author of The China Nexus. He sheds light on the protests happening across China, the human rights abuses in the country, and how the Chinese regime's influence has spread into free countries too. Benedict, thank you so much for joining us. Great to have you on the show.
Thank you very much. Good to be with you.
So I want to begin with your book, the copy right here, The China Nexus, and you have an interesting story behind it. So can you just briefly tell us why you wrote this book?
Yes, so I first went to China when I was 18 years old to teach English for 6 months in Qingdao on the East Coast. And I had a wonderful time there. I made a lot of friends. I fell in love really with China. But over the subsequent years, I've seen the Chinese Communist Party become increasingly repressive across the board, dismantling Hong Kong's freedoms in breach of an international treaty, committing genocide against the Uyghurs, intensifying the persecution of Christians, the atrocities in Tibet, of course the persecution of Falun Gong and forced organ harvesting, and the crackdown on civil society and lawyers. And independent media and dissidents. And on top of all of that, of course, the threats to Taiwan and indeed the threats to our own freedoms. And I looked at all these developments and I realized that although there are many books on China, there are really very few that put all these different pieces together to show the picture of the increasing repression within China, but also aggression beyond China's borders by the CCP. But I also wanted to put across the message that I'm not anti-China. In fact, I'm very pro-China as a country from my experiences living and working there and traveling extensively. But it's the CCP that I'm a critic of. And I think making that message very clear is really important.
On that note, you do say in your book there's a way to be pro-China, right, but not pro-CCP. So you can kind of explain the differences between these, because sometimes people conflate the two. So how are they different?
Well, we often use the term China as sort of shorthand for the CCP, and that's understandable in conversation. But we should be clear about the difference. China as a country is, of course, a great and ancient civilization with a huge history that long predates the CCP. Being pro-China, I think, means respecting that, valuing that, but most importantly, being on the side of the people of China who are suffering under the CCP. And the CCP, on the other hand, is the regime that currently rules China, but it has no legitimacy. Nobody elected it, and it is, particularly at the moment under Xi Jinping, an extremely authoritarian, you might even say totalitarian now, regime that is suppressing all its people, and particularly anybody who holds a belief that is at variance with the CCP's ideology.
On that note, why is the Chinese Communist Party so against faith? It says it's intrinsically atheist, so what is it about faith that it seems to fear?
Yeah, it's interesting. I have a chapter in the book on the persecution of Christians, but the principle applies, of course, to all the groups, the Uyghurs, Tibetan Buddhists, Falun Gong, and anybody who has any spiritual or religious belief. But there are two quotes in the book, one from Pastor Wang Yi, who's now in prison, who was a very prominent house church pastor, and the other from the former US Ambassador at Large for International Religious Freedom, Sam Brownback. And both of them use this phrase that the CCP has launched a war against faith. And I think the CCP, I mean, it's always been hostile to faith, but it seems to be particularly so now, because it is hostile firstly to any alternative belief system, any gathering of people that it feels it doesn't control and perhaps are not loyal to its beliefs. In particular, I think it sees, because it's an inherently atheist belief system in the CCP, it sees faith as representing ideals and values and beliefs that can empower people, can give people strength and courage, and it doesn't want people to have those things.
On the note of strength and courage, it seems right now we're seeing all these protests erupting across China. Some are just about the COVID lockdowns there, some are calling for the end of the CCP or even for Xi Jinping to step down, and especially among the younger students, there are calls for freedom. So how do you see these protests? What has changed that so many people are speaking out?
I think the protests are extremely significant. I think they're the most significant protests that we have seen in China since the Tiananmen Square massacre of 1989. There have, of course, been other protests in the intervening years, but mostly the protests until now had been focused on a specific issue, and a lot of them have been focused on labour rights. This is the first time in many years that we have seen such widespread, large-scale protests across so many cities where, as you say, people are not shouting end the zero COVID policy or end the COVID lockdowns, even though those were the things that sparked the protests. But they are chanting Xi Jinping step down, CCP step down, and we want freedom and democracy. And I think that's hugely significant because it tells us that, contrary to what the CCP would like us to believe, the people of China have not actually been indoctrinated by the CCP, and I think we are seeing the boiling over of frustration and discontent that has been simmering for some time with the increasingly repressive nature of the regime, the surveillance state, but also the economic slowdown. And I think Xi Jinping has broken the sort of unspoken pact between the party and the people that previously existed, which was that the CCP would have some degree of legitimacy in the eyes of the people in return for presiding over an economic boom that saw living standards raised significantly, and that in the 90s and early 2000s allowed for a certain amount of limited space. Xi Jinping has dismantled all of that. He seems to be hostile to private enterprise and entrepreneurialism, and is undoing some of the economic reforms of his predecessors. And I think we're seeing Chinese people expressing their discontent both with the repression and with the economic slowdown and the fact that the party has broken that unspoken pact.
Expanding on that, how would, say, Western countries, the US, UK, all these other ones, how would they help the Chinese people who are calling for freedom?
Well, I think first and foremost, we should be messaging very clearly that we stand with the Chinese people, the people who are protesting, and those who are not protesting but who share the same goals. And we should be really clear about that. I think we should be finding ways to get information into the country to circumvent the great firewall of China, and to help communicate support to the people of China. And we should also be standing up to the CCP regime in Beijing, and signalling, most especially at this time, that if they were to embark on a really serious crackdown, there will be serious consequences. And I think for too long we've allowed the CCP to get away with impunity with atrocities and crimes against humanity. We should be preparing to use really tough targeted sanctions, not against China or the people of China, but against the CCP.
Given how severe these are, given their name crimes against humanity, why isn't the Western world doing more? Is it the entanglement financially, or what's your take on why much of the world is silent?
I think it's probably a combination of factors. I mean, in terms of what's happening in China itself, I think the business and financial connections are the most powerful reason for the rest of the world's silence. That silence is starting to change. More people are speaking up, more governments are speaking up, but they're speaking up but not necessarily acting. And that's what we need to push them to do. In terms of Burma and or Myanmar and North Korea, It's a real tragedy because, especially what's happened in Burma over the last year and a half since the coup there, you would have thought that it would command the world's attention. I suppose two factors that has meant it hasn't gained the attention it should probably are, of course, the war in Ukraine, which has commanded most of our attention, and also the legacy of COVID and the economic challenges that we're facing.
That was Benedict Rogers, co-founder, chief executive of Hong Kong Watch, and author of The China Nexus. After a break, we hear more from him on what can be done in terms of the human rights atrocities happening in China and how we can protect our own freedoms here at home. That's coming up in just a minute here on China in Focus. When it comes to the human rights issues, you mentioned earlier some people are speaking out about it but not taking the action. So what would those actions look like if they're taken?
So in the book I outline 10 recommendations. I won't go through them all now, but I group the 10 recommendations into 3 categories. And the first is to end impunity, to ensure accountability, and to put in place punitive measures so that the CCP knows that there are consequences for its crimes. And that hasn't really happened until now, with the exception of a few sanctions from the United States and a few token sanctions by 1 or 2 other countries. We haven't really used the sanctions tools that we have, whether that's targeted Magnitsky sanctions, for which many of our countries have legislation, or whether it's other sanctions measures that could be taken. So using sanctions, but also looking at what can we do to hold the regime accountable, what justice mechanisms could be created to do that. That's the first set of actions that I think we should take. And I should say also, most importantly, re-examining our economic relationship, and if not totally decoupling, which I recognise is probably, without doubt is extremely difficult to do and certainly impossible overnight, at least diversifying our economic relationships so that we reduce our strategic dependency on China, and can afford then to take the tough action that is needed whilst broadening our trading relationships with other countries. So that's the first set of measures. Secondly, we should be looking at what we can do to help people who are suffering under the CCP get out if they need to find sanctuary in the free world, but also how we can support them, those who choose to stay, and continue in their dissent and their resistance to the CCP. And then thirdly, what we can do to protect and defend our own freedoms in our own societies, because the CCP is becoming an ever-increasing threat to our freedoms through its infiltration and influence operations.
On that last part, the influence operations, especially abroad, given that you've spent time inside China and also in Hong Kong and might know the signs better than other people, what have you seen in the Western countries, like signs of this influence?
Well, I think the influence is really extensive and pervasive across many sectors. So we see it in the higher education sector, in universities, the use of Confucius institutes as propaganda outlets for the CCP, the intimidation of Hong Kong or Uyghur or Tibetan students in our university campuses, the weaponization of funding to influence universities. We see it in Wall Street, in Hollywood, in politics. Just recently we heard reports from Canada of the CCP's influence on through funding of 11 political candidates in Canada. Earlier this year in the UK, our intelligence agencies exposed the operations of one individual, Christine Lee, who turned out to be working for the CCP's United Front Work Department, which is their main body that used for these influence and infiltration operations. And I'm sure, you know, she wasn't acting alone. She's just the tip of the iceberg. In a much smaller way, I myself have had some experience of threats from Beijing, letters to my home address, to my neighbors, even to my mother. So yeah, it's pretty extensive, and I think all our countries in the free world need to wake up to it.
And when it comes to you, you mentioned like you're banned in China. They even stopped you from entering Hong Kong recently after the national security law. So what are they afraid of? Why aren't they letting you and others like you in?
Well, that's a question I often ask, because it seems that they have a vastly inflated opinion of my influence, because, as you say, I was denied entry to Hong Kong actually in 2017, so before the national security law, and I was probably the first Westerner to be banned. But then I was threatened by the Hong Kong police under the national security law, actually threatened with a prison sentence for being what they called a threat to China's national security. And they seem to be just incredibly scared of two things: the truth, but also any criticism. And it appears that even someone as, you know, relatively insignificant as me, they regard with alarm. And to me, that says that actually this is not a confident and secure regime. It's a much more fragile and insecure regime than perhaps we sometimes realize.
And then I guess on the flip side, in a way, you've had quite the journey, right? You've been a journalist inside China, you've interviewed the Dalai Lama, you've interviewed all these different people. But over all these years, maybe what was the one story that really stood out to you?
I think there were so many stories, and when I was researching the book, I did more than 80 interviews for the book. But possibly one of the stories that most stood out was a very prominent Hong Kong activist, Alex Chow, who was one of the leaders of the Umbrella movement in 2014. And he was one of the very first political prisoners in Hong Kong. I mean, since he and Nathan Law and Joshua Wong were first jailed in 2017. Of course, there have been hundreds more since then. But Alex described to me a combination of both the real pain and trauma that he and his family went through when he went to prison, but also how he was then able to turn his time in prison to productive use. So he described to me his mother coming to visit him in prison and then being unable to embrace or to touch each other because he was behind a screen, and she was in tears, and he was thinking to himself, you know, on the one hand, I've done nothing wrong, I've tried to do the right thing, but on the other hand, I've caused this pain for my mother. And so that terrible human conflict that he was going through, he described very, very movingly. But then he described how in his time in prison he started to advocate for very small things for the rights of prisoners, to have access to newspapers or various other changes in the prison rules, and he succeeded, and he got a number of things in prison changed, and I think that was very inspiring to see. Even in prison, an activist never stops being an activist, and can use their influence for good.
And then for you, human rights seems an important issue, so why is it so important to you?
Well, I first started to get involved in human rights work when I was at university, and it has grown from there. And I think it's important basically because I am someone who was born and grew up in a free society where we take these freedoms for granted. We assume that it's perfectly normal to be able to express an opinion, to be able to practice a religion or not practice a religion, as depending on your choice, to be able to disagree with others without having a knock on the door and being taken to prison. And I think when I learnt of so many countries, and I happen to have focused particularly on Asia, but of course so many parts of the world where people are not free. I feel that those of us who have freedom have a responsibility not to take it for granted, but actually to cherish it, to protect it, and to use our freedoms on behalf of those who are denied them.
And Benedict, any last words?
I hope that my book, The China Nexus, serves as a helpful wake-up call and a call to action. It sets out, in a way that I haven't seen any other books do, the scale and severity of the challenges in China today and the challenges posed by the CCP to our own countries. It sets out some thoughts on what we do about them, and I hope that readers will learn from it and will, most importantly, not just read it, but actually then, if they're not already involved, join the cause and join the fight for freedom in China.
Well, Benedict, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much.
That was Benedict Rogers, co-founder and chief executive of Hong Kong Watch and author of The China Nexus. Thanks for watching China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. See you soon.